Good afternoon and welcome to our webcast, IIoT Design Considerations. I'm your moderator, Bob Vavra, and I'm happy to join you today on behalf of Plant Engineering, Control Engineering, and Oil and Gas Engineering. Toby Cahoon is a senior analyst at IHS. He's a research analyst in the Discrete Automation and Switchgear Group at IHS. His research interests range from control systems, HMI, cybersecurity, industrial communications, switchgear, and embedded systems. He's a frequent speaker at industry events and has worked on multiple custom research projects. He holds a BS in chemistry from the University of Leeds. He's based in IHS's office outside of London. We are very pleased to have Toby joining us today all the way from London. Toby, good afternoon, and we're looking forward to your presentation.
Great. Thank you, Bob. So, hi everybody. My name is Toby Cahoon. I'm a senior analyst with the Industrial Group at IHS. Today I'm going to speak about some of the results from our recently published data on Factory of the Future, particularly focused on the Industrial Internet of Things. The presentation itself, or this part, will last for about 20 minutes, and there's some opportunity for questions at the end. So just before we look at the data itself, who are IHS? We're a company of about 9,000 people working in a variety of industries. I myself work in technology, but we also have a variety of specialists working in everything from automotive to chemicals to economics to oil and gas. Before we look in more detail at IoT, I just wanted to present this slide to give people some background on where it sits in the whole technology ecosystem. So there are a variety of very interesting technologies that are beginning to be widely adopted in the industrial space, of which IoT is one. Some of the ones you've identified as important are virtualization, wireless, industrial apps, analytics. But what do all these things mean? I think one of the really great things, or one of the really great frameworks to understand, is to talk about the power of 1%. So in itself, none of these technologies are especially earth-shattering. They may provide just a small marginal improvement on the old ways of doing things, the power of 1%. But if you can begin to improve things incrementally and compound those changes over time, then by the end of many years of work and innovation, then you end up with quite a compelling proposition, right? Especially when we're talking about process industries, which are very capital intensive. Ultimately, these kind of 1% technologies that are incrementally driving innovation and growth become something very powerful over time. But ultimately, it's important to note that IoT is just one technology in this whole ecosystem of technologies that are beginning to drive change in our industry. So just a quick word on the statistics I'll present. This presentation takes data from a user survey we ran partnering with the IHS Engineering 360 group. So IHS Engineering 360 are an engineering marketing organization. I'm sure many of the people listening to this will receive updates on them on their products of interest. But ultimately, IHS Engineering, they have a huge amount of, they have a country of engineers that are engaged and active. And as part of being analysts, we're able to ask them questions about what they see affecting the industry. And everyone's very switched on, very engaged, and it's very valuable to know what people think, especially in a very emerging technology like IIoT. Although that's not to say that we didn't ask them other things, so the survey focused on two other topics as well, which I'll go into if there are some questions on digitization and industrial apps respectively. But this presentation particularly focuses on the process industry side, and once again particularly focuses on what end users, whether that's system integrators or asset owners or other people in the value chain, think. So just once again some frame of reference to who responded. Purely looking at people in the process industry, we have people from a variety of different industries, and everybody We had a very broad collection of respondents in terms of what the industry type was, with areas like oil and gas, power and chemicals particularly well represented. So just moving on to the statistics itself, one of the questions we always asked are, so what do we define as IIoT? So the Industrial Internet of Things, we see it as connecting devices using IP networks like TCP IP, and to do novel things that aren't possible before, doing completely new things that might have been very expensive or difficult over older communication networks. So a reasonable question to ask is, how popular is this? So once again, I'm sure everybody on the call, they're maybe thinking about IoT projects and they're thinking, where exactly is the rest of the industry at? What do my peers think? So one of the questions we asked, the Industrial Internet of Things is connecting IT systems to automation systems using IP networking to enable new functions which were previously impossible. Does your organization have a formal IoT initiative? And once again, the sample frame is purely the process industry. And so respondents could see yes, no, and no with plans to start in 3 years, and no with no plans to start. And this is kind of interesting, right? So the process industry is perceived to be, pretty conservative, and has a very, very long update cycle between integrating new software and new electronics for good reason, right? Once again, it's very capital intensive, it's very costly to do these things, and obviously there's a safety and kind of continuity aspect to doing anything that might be perceived as unnecessary. So in some respects, it's quite surprising that almost a third of respondents claimed that they would be doing, or they have an IoT initiative. And what's interesting as well is we also see is a very high growth area as well. So of those that aren't doing it, a significant proportion plan to do it soon. So clearly this is an idea that's gaining some traction. And that makes sense, right? So once again, just to come back to the process industry, very competitive, very capital intensive. These marginal gains that you can get by adopting a technology, these give the leaders a significant competitive advantage over people that are doing nothing. And if you can compound those gains, then these become an important competitive differentiator over time. So what we expect to see is that those leaders will put those laggards under pressure, and eventually I think it will be astonishing if nobody plans to do something that's we would classify as IoT in the next few years. But that's a little way off. So the next question we asked, the next question I'm presenting, of those people that have an IoT initiative and of those people that plan to have an IoT initiative, who exactly is responsible for implementing that? Once again, a few kind of surprising things here. So first of all, IT people are actually generally tend to be in charge of IoT. And once again, it's kind of surprising because a lot of this is to do with integrating automation systems, which obviously, once again, have a very important safety and continuity requirements. So clearly there's, and we see this in other reports as well, there's kind of a blurring between IoT job functions and what were traditionally engineering job functions. There used to be a lot more separation between the two domains, but clearly due to the proliferation of off-the-shelf computing technology, IP networking, the IT guys have a lot more say in things that would have once been the automation guys' domain. And clearly we have to kind of adapt to that new reality. The other thing that was kind of surprising, so IoT is a word that's gained a lot of traction, is that the job functions that are more at the bottom of the organization pyramid, so the people more at the kind of the coal face of the company, the engineers and the IT guys, they seem to be driving this, right? And it's not driven by people on the management side. So clearly it's not just a buzzword. People are adopting IoT technologies, and it's driven by, let's say, the people that are actually more involved in the day-to-day running in the business rather than a tops-down type initiative, which is kind of encouraging. So this is what it all comes down to. What do people want to do with IoT or IoT? We identified 6 applications which we believe are the most important ones. And we asked people, do they have an application or do they plan to use it soon? It's interesting, but they don't quite see the use cases for it, or it's an irrelevant application. And what we see is there's a variety of functions that are in use widely across different industries. The only real outlier where people don't seem to be doing so much is machine learning. What's kind of interesting for me, and the reason why I think business analytics might have pipped it to the top as the most in use or planned to be in use application, is it's kind of one of those Pareto principle type applications. So what do I mean by that? What kind of requires 20% effort but kind of gets you 80% of the results. So business analytics can mean lots of things. That can be simply the accountants in the company can get a good handle on what's going on in the business, but it could even be looking at ways to improve the yield of a particular process and other parameters, and taking a very deep look into the process to improve it. But once again, there's huge scope to do some improvements there, and it's kind of like one of the obvious first steps. So one of the things that we think is that companies will build the infrastructure around a single application that has the best ROI, but over time they'll just add and add to it, and they will snowball. So we think the amount of applications in use for the average IoT initiative is approximately 2, but over time that number's only going to increase. So these early applications, their success kind of seed the market for future growth. One of the interesting things is if you take a slightly different perspective by industry. So the last sample frame, was purely looking at guys in the process industry overall. And this slide purely looks at a smaller subset of companies that identify themselves as belonging to the oil and gas industry. What we see is a slightly different order of the most in use and the most planned application, and that's predictive maintenance. Now, predictive maintenance is a really, really interesting one. So I think it really encapsulates some of the power of the IoT concept. So it's not exactly a new thing, right? People have been talking about doing predictive analytics on their equipment for a long time, but today it's largely limited to the most expensive piece of equipment like turbines that are extraordinarily expensive to remediate. What we see is that companies, and there's a lot of startups in this area, are pushing the concepts that more and more devices will begin to look at their failure modes, and correspondingly we can replace those devices before they become an issue. And this is quite a big shift from the more reactive type maintenance in the past. So correspondingly, some of the benefits of predictive maintenance is potentially a lot lower downtime than in the past. And this is quite a compelling benefit if you think that it can cost millions of dollars per hour to have a process line not performing. So once again, a very, very compelling benefit, and this is really driven by IoT. This isn't a new concept, but due to the falling costs of connectivity and ubiquitous sensing, means it's way more economical to do as part of a larger scale IP network than it has been in the past. So just some thought on some of the challenges and kind of open questions facing the industry. Some of these we've touched on already. The first is cybersecurity. So we see cybersecurity as an important issue among organizations of all sizes. And it's really good that companies are becoming more aware. So my personal perspective is that cybersecurity probably won't be a serious inhibitor for adoption of new technology, because a lot of the benefits are probably enough to overcome that reluctance. But clearly that could change if there's some event that means that people face some adverse consequences due to their IoT deployments. One of the ways, and this could be a presentation in itself, one of the ways we see the industry reacting appropriately is the adoption of a standard called IEC 62443, which describes how devices should be secured across its entire life cycle. So that's very encouraging, and it will be interesting to see the first devices come to market that have more embedded security and meet that standard or meet a security level of that standard. Another key question is CapEx, so capital investment. We've all seen that in 2015, the oil and gas industry, for example, has struggled, and so lower profitability generally means slower adoption of new technologies. Once again, we don't see this as an inhibitor that will affect the overall market in the long term, but in the short term, say prices of commodities and other factors can have a significant impact on when exactly these ideas come on stream. Third point is expertise. So I think an analogy is when control systems became more computerized in the 1970s. Obviously that required kind of a new skill set and a deepening of the control engineering profession. And we face some of the same challenges with IoT, right? So we talked about cybersecurity. It's very difficult to hire people that have automation expertise and security expertise. And a lot of these applications that we're talking about with IoT, a lot of them will require people like data scientists. And it's a pretty interesting question. Will we be producing enough, data scientists and people with the know-how to be able to get the full benefits of it, rather than just on a prototype or have a one-off basis? And the final point we touched on already, a tension between IT and the kind of engineering side of the business. Maybe just an anecdote about that. So one time I heard a company was interested in moving almost all of their nodes to an IP network, but what they found was they had a contract with an IT company that meant the IT company were paid for every IP addressable node. So as you can imagine, they decided not to do that because it made it uneconomical. And those kind of tensions are real. Ultimately, people will need to work better and work better together than they have in the past to make sure some of these things are a success. So with that, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to listen to me talk about IIoT. Just as a final point, I've put up some of the comments we got from our open question. What do you see as the challenges facing your company? Perhaps nothing too surprising there, but once again, if you're interested in what some of your peers think, I think that's these three comments were fairly typical of the people we surveyed. And with that, I'd like to hand back to you, Bob, for your questions.
Thanks very much, Toby, and we'll be getting to a lot of the questions and some of the issues involved in IIoT in just a moment. For our audience, you can type questions for Toby in the Ask a Question box on the screen. We'll get to those as we can, and within a few days, this presentation is going to be available on-demand viewing as well. We're going to be sending an email link to everybody, connecting you directly to it, and all of the related resources involved. Toby, from the Q&A standpoint today, and I wanted to go back to an earlier slide and something you mentioned very much at the end of this in terms of the responsibilities. We've seen this IT-OT convergence, and we're hearing a lot about IT-OT, and for some people this is an arranged marriage, some of it's a shotgun wedding, but it does seem that in order for IIoT to work, IT and OT are going to have to work very, very closely together. From your experience, is this an evolving process that is going to come more to the front now that we're talking about IIoT going forward?
Yeah, I think so, yes. And, it's one of those things, as you touched on, there's an element of necessity in it to make things work right. And I think it's happens in any industry that faces some disruption, that these new emerging jobs might require a slightly different skill set and once again, we can't really think siloed anymore. So, it's one of those things born out of necessity, and I don't know whether you can ever necessarily kind of solve the problem, but you can, I think, do your best to try to live with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I see this as really adding some democracy to the plant floor, where it's been a very top-down process. One of the opportunities with IIoT seems to us to be the ability to deliver data to specific people within a facility to give them exactly the information that they need at any given moment. So from an IT standpoint, that's a challenge, but also an opportunity to be able to really help the operations people. And from the operations side, it's an opportunity for them to be able to communicate to IT and all the way up the organizational chain to give them a more focused approach to what individual jobs they need to do, whether it be maintenance, whether it be improving energy management, whatever it might be in the facility. It seems to me to be that both sides have something to gain in terms of efficiency and visibility here.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's kind of linked to another trend that we surveyed on mobile devices on the factory floor. And what we found was, there's a tremendous desire to do some of especially in industries that have remotely stranded assets, to get data to the people that need to make some decisions, whether that's maintenance or the operators or management. Just trying to work in a more modern way rather than dealing with this large distributed base of fixed assets.
Right. Yeah, the HMI is going on the road, it looks like, and everybody's going to have an HMI in their hand at some point along the line, rather than it being a fixed device attached to a machine.
Yeah, I think there's always going to be fixed HMI, and we think that anything, so whether you access it on your tablet or smartphone, that will only ever be complementary, but clearly people will do more using those type of smart devices, way more than they have in the past, and people will once again need to adapt their ways of working.
Yeah, and that brings me back. I pulled up the some of the questions you pointed out, and one of the top ones certainly has been cybersecurity. We've all heard about the technical issues. It seems that a lot of the issues around cybersecurity are not so much external forces coming in to do deliberate harm, as perhaps internal people with their own smartphones or their own tablets compromising the network with third-party software or some other sort of secondary use for the handheld device instead of what it's really being intended for at work. The short answer, I guess, would be guys checking their fantasy sports statistics or the latest ball game results on their smartphone at the same time they're supposed to be working on a piece of equipment. That seems to be where cybersecurity for a lot of people is going to be. I thought it was interesting what you said, is that this is going to be one of those areas where we're going to have to make a cost versus risk assessment. Yeah,
so I think just to come back to your point, we think about 20% of organizations today actually issue their employees with devices that are clearly locked down for that company. So hopefully you won't have people checking social media or other stuff they shouldn't do at work and bring in malicious files. So that's one aspect to it. One of the problems is, I definitely agree with your comment that at least the perceived risk today is internal threats, especially people not necessarily malicious but doing it accidentally. So that's, I think, one of the issues with cybersecurity is that there's almost no data about the prevalence of attacks and what type of attacks they are. So the best data we have is what people perceive as important. And you're right, the perception is that internal threats are the most important. And as I said, we see the evolution of standards like IEC 62443 as important for the industry.
I'm interested to hear you say that that many people are already issuing mobile devices within their facility, about 20%, you said. Certainly that number is going to increase. Do you see it starting to be a greater increase as we get more companies involved in IIoT?
Yeah, so I don't think the issuing of devices is necessarily directly linked to IIoT or the cybersecurity trend. I think it's more, doing basic stuff like making sure you can contact your maintenance engineers at all times, and so that's why it's been historically been a driver. But as people can do, but I think so that's how it's been in the past. But in the future, I think it will become more of a factor, and especially as companies like automation suppliers move to a more mobile strategy. So it's kind of a chicken and egg thing, right? People don't move to mobile because there's not very much there today, but that will change.
I want to go back to this. I thought this was probably, in a very interesting presentation, probably the most interesting slide that I had, because I hadn't seen it displayed in quite this way, is the interest in what people actually want to do with IIoT. And as you said, this is the process industry, but I've seen the process industry well ahead on most of these issues from discrete for a long, long time. So this was very interesting. The business drivers are certainly significant, as this chart notes, but predictive maintenance and remote servicing are also significant areas to experience some real growth, along with energy analytics. So it seems like it's not just a business driver; it's really an operations driver as well.
Yeah, so I think because one of the things about this graph is that although we talk about the process industry, it is made up of all those constituent parts. So that's why I particularly wanted to pull out the oil and gas example. So when you cross-tab this in various ways, it does look a bit different. But yeah, I mean, the process industry faces quite a few of the same challenges as the discrete industry. But a lot of the stuff around IIoT has, if you look at the application examples from vendors, a lot of it has focused on the discrete side, but that's, I say, it's not to say the process guys are just standing still.
Yeah, and let's look at that oil and gas for a second. The predictive maintenance area, particularly in oil and gas, is absolutely critical. Those systems very often run 24/7, 365, and so their ability to get ahead of potential shortfalls have economic impact not only for those individual facilities, but those kind of breakdowns tend to go through the overall economic chain very, very quickly. So their emphasis on predictive maintenance ahead of even business analytics, I think, speaks to the importance of oil and gas as a global economic driver rather than just a facility issue.
Yeah, so I think oil and gas has definitely been one of those industries that were into predictive maintenance in a big way already, but it's just taking it to that next step. So rather than moving to maybe a few devices per facility, looking at tens, hundreds, or even thousands of devices per site. So that's the next step, and that is IIoT, because the key driver behind it is that cost of sensing has come down, the cost of connectivity has come down, and it's just not economical to do unless, let's say, the monitoring assets is at a very small cost.
And I thought that was a really interesting point that you made, is that we're having the technology drive from the one side, but the cost of implementation is coming further and further down, making this more and more available to small and mid-sized manufacturers who, frankly, I think can benefit from this in a more dramatic way. A lot of the large process industries already have a fairly large degree of this. It's that small to mid-sized manufacturer who can really get a better grip on some of the costs and pressures within their business through IIoT and make some really significant gains in their operations.
Yeah, that's true. So I didn't present it in the presentation, but if you do an analysis of organization size versus having a IoT initiative, there is all companies of all sizes are looking at IoT for the first time, or perhaps for the first time. But also there's quite a strong dependence. So the larger the company, as you might expect, is a bit more advanced than the largest. The larger companies tend to have a high proportion of people doing IoT versus the smaller ones. But we would expect the SME type companies to catch up.
Yeah, and we're seeing a tremendous amount of interest among all of our readers in this area, and we're in the process of building a program that's going to help explain IIoT through these series of webcasts, through a number of articles that we're going to be doing over the next year and a half, and really looking on it as a global initiative, because some of the larger international companies really are using this as a way both to understand what's happening in their individual facilities in a given location, but also benchmark them against one another so that they can find and implement some greater efficiencies in their overall operation.
Yeah, that's true. So I think one of the problems people are trying to solve is that, even superficially similar units might have a surprisingly different performance in terms of yield or quality. So if you can if you can get deep information on the process, you can begin to understand why, and then hopefully take some action to try to change that. So all units are equally great, and companies that have a global platform and have a lot of assets that they can compare will benefit the most from that.
Absolutely. Let's talk about one last area on this topic. What are some of the barriers that you see to IIoT implementation, and what are some of the ways that what are some of the things that manufacturers need to understand as they start to really evaluate an IIoT implementation?
So I think we touched on some of them already. So there's objections like cybersecurity and expertise. That's definitely one. So obviously, as people gain knowledge, it will become easier because people, will have those teaching moments and whatever. But one of the things we didn't talk about was that the process industry is quite heavily reliant on technologies that aren't IP addressable, like various fuel buses, and a lot of stuff is still connected with 4 to 20 milliamp connections. So a lot of the things out there might have some stranded information that it's quite difficult to integrate. Now that's not really something you can solve, right? Because a lot of these devices, they're perfectly good at their job, and it's not necessarily economical to replace them. The way that's going to change is that over time, industrial Ethernet will come to the process instrumentation level, and it is there today. But we'll see it more in a big way. But we just have to wait for the natural replacement cycle of electronics, because not all ideas, even if the benefits of doing something are compelling, not all ideas are necessarily feasible at this particular time. So it's just kind of waiting for the natural replacement cycle of the industry, and that's related to things like capex and the failure rate of your instruments, and if you can simply buy the thing anymore.
One final question. We've seen the discussion about Industry 4.0 in Europe, industrial Internet of Things, connected factories, smart factory, a number of different phrases that have evolved around this. Can you talk a little bit about differences between what you see from Industry 4.0 in Europe versus Industrial Internet of Things in the U.S. and in some other places?
I would say it's probably better to emphasize what they have in common. So if you go back to the earlier slides, we prefer to, at IHS, the term we prefer to use is smart manufacturing, and we see things like the industrial internet and Industry 4.0 as kind of variations on that. But ultimately, we're talking about the complementary use of a variety of different technologies that are changing the industry. So I'd probably emphasize more and emphasize to your listeners more what they have in common rather than how they're different.
It's going to be a very interesting evolution for manufacturing. And as we said before, that IIoT convergence is going to be a very, very exciting thing to be watching over the next few months and over the next couple of years. It's going to be a very exciting time, and we look forward to working with IHS on helping to explain that to our readers in future opportunities. I want to thank Toby for his presentation today, and did a really wonderful job. We will be having this webcast on demand very shortly. This is the Design Considerations 1, which as we mentioned before, was delayed from an earlier presentation due to some technical issues. We will be talking about operations on Thursday, September 17th, with Greg Gorbach from ARC Advisory Group making that presentation, and talking about integration on Tuesday, November 3rd, to continue the CFE Media webcast series with plant engineering, control engineering, and oil and gas engineering. I want to thank Toby Cahoon from IHS for helping us out all the way from London today on this presentation. We will be taking your questions, and those we have not been able to get to today at this presentation. We will be providing answers offline to you, and that'll be part of the on-demand presentation of this, and we'll be sending you an email when those questions and answers are ready.